The 1970s was an incredible decade for music. Not only did we see the rise of heavy metal with bands like Black Sabbath, but the 70s also ushered in a new era for rock music. David Bowie was riding high from the success of his Ziggy Stardust era with albums such as Diamond Dogs and the rise and fall of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars. The Ramones had also released their debut record. Led Zeppelin had arguably become the biggest rock band on the planet. And the late 70s witnessed the birth of punk rock. The 70s was a decade like no other when it came to music, one we'll most likely never see again. Towards the end of the 1960s, a new style of rock was emerging. With the 60s being heavily dominated by pop music, a new breed of musician started to diversify their sound and move away from the polished pop sound, embracing elements of rock and psychedelia with hints of blues music. The new genre would be labelled progressive rock, or prog rock for short. It was an exploration of music that would embrace the true depths of a musician's soul. Often trademarked with experimental time signatures, diverse melodies and song structures, whilst usually being heavily influenced by mind-altering substances or science fiction.
It does happen to Roy.
The first widely accepted prog rock album was recorded by an English band called King Crimson in 1969. The album, entitled In the Court of King Crimson, is still to this day one of the most widely acknowledged influential prog rock albums of the genre. Forming in the same year as King Crimson and Black Sabbath was a Canadian prog rock band called Rush. Although the band formed in 1968, the man who would become known as the Professor didn't join the band until 1974. The Professor would eventually be recognised as one of the greatest drummers and lyrical composers of all time. He would also help to see Rush elevated to prog rock legends. That man was none other than Neil Peart. Neil Peart completely changed how Rush would approach songwriting. While singer and bass player Geddy Lee, along with guitarist Alex Lifeson, would focus on pushing the band's blues rock sound, Neil Peart would begin to write epic tales of science fiction and fantasy that would lead to some of the most complex song arrangements of the time. Neil Peart would become the band's principal lyricist and ultimately their biggest driving force. (1975) saw the band release their first two records with Peart, Fly By Night and Caress of Steel. Fly By Night would include Rush's first mini tale of science fiction, a 9-minute-long progressive rock track called By Tor and the Snow Dog. But this was only the beginning of Peart's genius musical visions. 1976 would see Rush release one of their most iconic records to date, a record that inspired a new generation of musicians all over the globe to pick up a pair of drumsticks, including Nirvana legend Dave Grohl. This record would kick off with a 7-part, 20-minute-long futuristic science fiction song called 2112, which was also the name of the album. Neil Peart said this opening track was inspired by a science fiction novel written by Ayn Rand, a Russian-American writer and philosopher born in St. Petersburg in 1905.
And philosophy is the science that studies the basic nature of existence.
Rand accredited her own creative influence to the Greek philosopher Aristotle, Her quest for an understanding of humanity and the origins of existence is something Neil Peart also seemed to be fascinated by.
So I started reading, trying to gather all kinds of fiction, trying to fill in the gaps in my education, and a lot of nonfiction from history, philosophy, geography, natural science.
Peart's seemingly never-ending obsession with knowledge would also spill over into his never-ending obsession with his love for drumming and songwriting.
Drums and cymbals in general, it might be said that the drums are the verbs and subjects of the sentence.
An obsession that would inspire him to write some of the most memorable songs throughout Rush's career and become what some would say as the greatest drummer of all time. These early obsessions and passions with drumming and reading would lead to Rush releasing some of the greatest rock records of all time, one of which was 2112. Even by today's standards, the production, composition, and concept is truly impressive and unique. A truly powerful record that will help to keep the memory of Neil Peart well and truly alive for many years to come. Neil Peart didn't just look at his drum kit as a percussion instrument, he saw his instrument as a way to translate his knowledge of the world and his stories into sound. This approach to writing resonated with millions of people around the world and gave his work a stamp of credibility that few musicians can replicate. His very soul was wired into the lyrics he put to paper.